Ready? Okay, welcome back, everybody. As you guys are finishing your lunches, we will get started with our keynote address. I'm happy to be introducing Brian Nosek. He is a professor at the University of Virginia. He's the executive director at the Center for Open Science. Among his career accolades, he helped create the IAT. He was one of the co-founders of the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. And he helped found the Center for Open Science. One of his biggest contributions to the literature is leading to a revolution in the way science is being approached in the psychological sciences. I'm happy to introduce him for his talk using collective action, collaboration, and the OSF to improve psychological science. Brian?
Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to join you this afternoon. What I'd like to talk about today is science as a social system. And like any system, it creates constraints and opportunities for us to engage in the work that we do in that system, sometimes that is aligned with our values and what we want and our goals, and sometimes putting us in positions to have to do things counter to our values and our goals and our interests. So take a moment just to think about, why are you interested in research? What draws you to doing research? If you're like me, it might be things that you're thinking of like, well, I'm curious, I like problem solving, I like exploring the unknown, I have particular issues that I'm passionate about and I want to study them and understand how they work and then export that knowledge to others. There's lots of common motivations like that. What you might not have been thinking about is, well, I really want to write a lot of grants in order to try to get my research funded. And I really want to spend time writing and rewriting papers to see if I can get them published in prestigious outlets. And I'm really motivated to get as many citations of my work as possible so that people will notice me and value me. Now, you may not have been thinking those things, but the system of science gets us to have to think about those things because they are the units of our advancement in research careers. And so the challenge that we have is to rethink about how is it that we want science to operate as a system that really aligns with the values that we bring to it. So let me start in talking a little bit more about what are the values of science as a system. And there's lots of ways to talk about it, but I particularly like Robert Merton's norms of research. You know, he's a sociologist of science. In the 1940s and 50s, he said there are sort of four ways to characterize the norms, the core values of what makes science a way of knowing things about the world compared to other ways of knowing things. So one of his norms is communality, the open sharing of information. You don't come to trust a scientific claim because I said, this is what I found, just trust me, that's what I found. Your trust in that finding is based on being able to see the evidence, see the data that was generated, see the process of inference to that data. How is it that people came to the conclusion? His second norm is universalism. Research is evaluated based on its own merit, right? It's the methodology itself that is a basis of deciding whether that's a credible claim or not. Not, oh, that's a famous person, they must know what they're talking about, so it must be true. Particularism. His third norm is disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery, just trying to figure out how things work, as opposed to self-interestedness. Really, what I'm here for is to beat everybody else, to get the best job, to get the best publications, and to win. My ideas need to win. That's not, in his sense, a norm of how scholarship should work. And his fourth norm was organized skepticism. Researchers consider all new evidence, even against their prior work, versus the counter norm of organized dogmatism. Once I publish something, then I spend the rest of my career defending it from all the attackers so that I can preserve my findings and my ideas. And while Merton didn't talk about it formally, there's a common discussion of a norm of quality over the norm of quantity. Now, when you look at those norms on the left compared to the ones on the right, you may recognize that as a general characterization of how people have talked about what science is, how science works. In our 5th grade introductions to science, that might be themes that came up in describing science as a system. But an obvious question is, do practicing researchers actually endorse those norms versus the counter norms? Is that how they think science should work? So there are a number of surveys on this. Anderson and her colleagues did one of NIH awardees. What you're seeing here is early career researchers in postdoctoral positions, mid-career researchers that have their first major grant, an R01 from NIH, so average age in early 40s there. And what you're seeing plotted is the cumulative survey responses to, do you endorse the norms on the prior slide or the counter norms? And in gray are the proportion of respondents who said, I endorse the norms over the counter norms, openness over secrecy, et cetera, et cetera. 90% of the sample says that they endorse those. In black are those that say, no, I think science should operate by the counter norms over the norms on average, right? Very small proportion. And then the gray diagonal are people who weight these about equally. So almost everyone agrees that the norms of scholarship should be how science operates. Then they said, okay, that's great. Thanks for telling me about how you think it should operate. How do you behave in your research? Do you follow the norms or do you follow the counter norms? And this is their responses. So still about 60 to 70% of people are saying that they follow the norms over the counter norms. But you can see that a more substantial proportion are saying that both of these have influence on their behavior. So then they said, okay, that's great. That's great. Don't tell me how you behave. Tell me how everybody else in your field, how do they behave? And it looks like this. So this is an operational definition of a dysfunctional research culture. Almost everyone endorses the norms of scholarship. Largely, people think that they behave by those norms, and they don't perceive the people around them, the same people, as behaving according to those norms. So if we want to have a high-functioning system, what we should want is that people have values that they bring to it. Ideally, they're shared values, and largely they are on these, that they are able to behave on those ways, and that they see that the culture around them also endorses and reinforces those values so that they get expressed in everyday behavior and they're valued in that environment. And that's not true just for science as a system. All of our social systems, we aspire to that. Can our values be expressed in the environments in which we live? So this is a core challenge. And of course, there's lots of things that we might identify of what is the gap that people are saying, I have these values and they're not being valued by my culture. Well, there's several things that people talk about in terms of the cultural challenges in science. The one that we focus on is the following, that the incentives for me advancing in my career as a researcher are focused on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. Of course, I want to get it right. I didn't get into science to publish papers. People don't do that. They get into science to discover things, to learn things, to find the truth, to advance knowledge. But publication is the currency of advancement. And it doesn't have to be right to get published. And not everything that we do, no matter how rigorous it is, gets published. Some things are more likely to get published than others. I'm more likely to get published finding a positive result. This intervention did have an impact on this. These variables are related, rather than finding a negative result. I'm more likely to get published finding something new, rather than getting additional evidence on a claim that's been made previously. And I'm more likely to get published if all of my evidence is neat and tidy and mutually reinforcing against the conclusion, rather than, oh, here's something that doesn't quite fit and I don't understand this part and this part is really challenging. So a positive, novel, tidy story is the best kind of story in science because it is the best story in science. If you discover something new, and comprehensively and completely explain it, you've made a major contribution to the literature. But that doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't happen on the pace of paper by paper by paper. It happens over decades of research, usually with many different researchers, because there's all kinds of stuff we don't understand about every study that we do. That's why we're studying these domains. They're hard problems. There's lots of exceptions and things that don't fit and parts that we don't quite understand. And so we are doing the work to accumulate a knowledge base that eventually we get to a positive, novel, tidy story. But if I need those things to get each reward, each publication, then there creates some incentive challenges. What's good for me might be to do some behaviors in my research. What's good for science might be other behaviors. So I want to unpack this a bit to sort of talk about what are the core challenges that this environment creates for the credibility of the research that we produce. So if we begin in thinking about those incentives for novel, positive, tidy outcomes, what are things that encourages us to do, even if we're not intending to do those things? Well, for one, I do lots of experiments in my lab. Only a subset of them get put into the papers that are eventually submitted for publication. How is it that I reduce from the 50 experiments that we did to the 5 that appear in the paper? Well, the ones that work, the ones that I see as supporting my hypothesis, well, of course, those are going in the paper. The ones that didn't work, well, I screwed up that method, and oh, that was a bad study. I don't know why we did that study. That's ridiculous. Let's put that one aside. Let's ignore that one. Right? So the practice of selective reporting will exaggerate the evidence that we have for phenomenon. If I run 100 experiments and I only report the 5 that worked, if you've taken intro stats, you know, no, you shouldn't do that. That's a problem, right? It misleads about the quality of the evidence. Second is questionable research practices. When I have my data, there are lots of choices that I can make about what is the right way to analyze this data. And a lot of those choices are reasonable choices. What is my exclusion rule for deciding whether participants should be in or out? What are the covariates that I should include or not include? How should these data be combined to an aggregate outcome measure? All those choices can be consequential for what the results are that you see at the end. But as I'm making those decisions, doing my analysis, I may rationalize to myself the ways that look better for publication as the right ways to report that result. I think that I'm reasoning, but I'm really just rationalizing because I have skin in the game, right? It matters for me what kind of outcome. And so if I don't have constraints, then all of those great things that I have in my frontal lobe to help me make sense of the world and to make sense of my own behaviors might be applied to make it so that I can get the right outcome for my advancement. If we're rewarded for the outcomes, then showing the data, the materials, the code that we use to apply to that data aren't part of the evaluation process. There's no reason for me to share that material, which makes it harder for you to understand what it is I did and how I did it. And replications are not something that's very useful to do given that reward because they're not novel. They're retesting or trying to verify or trying to get more evidence about a prior claim. And if I'm thinking about replicating a finding that I've gotten, we get this great new discovery in the lab. Should I replicate it? Well, what will happen if I run a replication and it does not support that finding that I got that we're all so excited about? Well, now we've lost the publication. Oh my God, we can't publish this because we tried to replicate and we couldn't. So why would I do a replication of my own work? And if you have a publication that I think was interesting, why would I replicate it if I can't get replications published? So it's not worth my time either. So a consequence of these behaviors are that if I'm selectively reporting results, if I'm applying different decisions that undermine the credibility of my findings, then the overall credibility of the literature is undermined. And if you can't see my data, you can't see the materials, you can't try to replicate, if no one is doing replications, then we don't have that idealized self-corrective process working very well because all you can see is the report that I wrote at the end of my research. You can't actually see the research itself. And you certainly can't build on it if I've not shared the materials that underlie that work. and the potential for replication to be able to give us additional insight on to what extent does that finding hold and under what conditions does it hold doesn't happen. And those things combine to just waste. We just spend a lot more effort on research and don't make as much progress because we have an exaggerated sense of what the quality of our literature actually is. So there are many potential outcomes of that. One of the areas that we've spent a fair bit of time on is taking samples of the research literature and trying to replicate the findings from those samples to see if the findings are as credible as they appear to be just by reading the pages in the journal. And we've done this in several different fields now. One from psychology 2015, we took 100 papers and tried to replicate key findings from those 100 papers, found much weaker evidence in the replications than in the original studies. In 2021, we published the same type of project with cancer biology. This is all preclinical cancer biology. Very similar results, reduction of effect size of 85% from the original findings to the replication findings. In that case, several of these findings had initiated clinical trials for potential therapeutics, had launched startups. They were trying to commercialize some new therapy for cancer, and the underlying data was not as reliable as we might presume for spending millions of dollars and putting cancer patients through such trials. So these are consequential, and they're consequential for psych too. Our stuff matters. So that's all the bad news. Now I want to talk about good news, which is we aren't stuck in the systems that we inhabit. We can change our systems because our systems are comprised of us. We get to decide how it is our social systems should work. And that doesn't mean it's easy to change them, but it does mean it's possible to do so. So what are the ways in which we can improve how our system works so that it's better aligned with the values that we have for why we're here doing research in the first place? The solutions that I want to focus on are these: sharing data, sharing materials, sharing code, pre-registration, which I heard some conversation about in the last session about OSF, registered reports, and replication. So let me take just concretely, apply those as solutions to that incentive challenge that I just showed in the previous slides. And just the storyline is simple for how it is these can help. So with open data, open materials, and open code, we change what is an opaque process. All you have is my report at the end, how I characterize my research. And if you can actually access all of the material underlying that research, you can assess, am I reporting it well? If you analyzed it different ways, does the effect hold up against the choices that I made? If you want to try to extend it or build on it or challenge it, can you get the materials to try to do so? So just having access to that provides an opportunity for verification, for self-correction, and for extension in new ways. If we actually value replication, if replication isn't something where people say, oh, that's boring drudge work, but in fact, it's generative work for trying to test the veracity of findings and explore under what conditions they actually hold, right? This was done at Ohio State in 1987. Does it actually happen elsewhere in other years and other times with other samples? That's a relevant question to know for many of the things that we investigate. So replication can be useful because the most common thing in our writing is to make generalized claims. We rarely say, this finding applies only in this situation, in this case, in this sample, at this time, at this institution, for this days. And never again will we see this particular phenomenon that I'm talking about, because we're not writing history. We're trying to develop generalized knowledge that says, I have an insight about this phenomenon that I think applies to more than the sample and the study that I ran itself. Replication enables that. And so again, helps with that self-corrective process. On the other side, the primary solution is pre-registration. So if I'm selecting which studies to report, if I'm employing decisions as I'm analyzing and reporting my data, it would be useful for you to be able to know that. I might be making the right decision. I might be perfectly justified in those decisions that I'm making. but you need to be able to know that I'm making those decisions. So if I pre-register each study as I plan to do it, then if I only report the 5 and leave out the other 95, then at least those are discoverable. You can say, oh, that's interesting. What happened to the other 95? And I say, oh, well, I don't know. And then you can update your confidence based on that response in the findings. If I pre-register my analysis plan, this is how I'm going to approach the data, here are the outcomes I'm going to look at, then it's very clear what was planned in advance without being able to see the data. How is it that I was going to treat it and then try to draw inference from it? And that's underlies a lot of the assumptions of null hypothesis significance testing, is that it's done prior to actually looking at the data. And what are the things that are unplanned, discovered after the fact? Both of those are very important, right? We acquire data to confront our current expectations, and that confrontation is facilitated by planning in advance how we're going to analyze it before we know what the data are, so that we are actually confronted by that data. And exploring that data is incredibly useful because we're almost always wrong. And so once we actually see the findings, we say, oh, wait a second, okay, I don't even know what I was doing. Let's look in the data. Let's see if we can learn something from this data that might inform the hypotheses that we generate, the things that we do next. And that exploratory part is really fun and really generative, but it is necessarily lower confidence than when we're actually confronting ourselves with hypotheses. And so we can embrace that. We can say, this was unplanned. I explored this. This is what I discovered. This is the ideas that I have of what I think we should do next, and call it out as exploration rather than dress it up as if I had thought that all along. If we do those things, we enable that more credible science because everything is reported. We know and can understand how it is that we got to these claims rather than having no idea that that stuff was happening because what didn't appear in the report. Last one I want to talk about addresses the core, the original challenge for the incentive problem in the system, and that is the outcomes itself being the driver of people's advancement. And registered reports is specifically targeted to try to alter the incentive. What does it take to get a publication? In the current system, you do all of the research, you finish the research, and then you submit it to the journal for review. And the review is often, mostly, about the outcomes. Did you find something interesting? Are your conclusions about the outcomes justified? Registered reports changes that in a fundamental way. So here's the cartoon of how the research process works, right? You design a study, you collect and analyze the data, you write the report, and you publish it. And of course, it's not that simple. There's this big barrier of peer review after that report is done before you get your reward, the publication. In this context, all of the incentives are about make that report as positive, novel, tidy as possible to get through the peer review so that you can get the reward that you need. With registered reports, there's a key singular change, which is to move the primary phase of peer review to after the design phase. So what you as an author do with registered reports is you write your intro. Here's the background. Here's the motivating questions underlying my research. You might have some exploratory evidence, some initial experiments just to test your paradigm. Here's little things that I've been thinking about. Here's some preliminary evidence. I think we have a hint of something here. And then you write up the methodology of your key studies or study. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the design. Here's our analysis plan. Here's how we're going to draw inferences. And the peer reviewers review that. And the questions that they ask are, is this an important question? And is this a rigorous methodology to test that question? They don't evaluate the results because there are no results. Study hasn't been completed yet. But the editor then takes all the reviews and says, is this important? Is this an effective methodology? And if it passes, then the journal pre-commits to publishing the article, regardless of what the outcomes are. They say, if you follow through with what you said you're going to do, we'll publish it. What should this do? This should entirely change the reward system for me as an author. right? In the original system, I need great outcomes. When you don't know the outcomes, how do people decide whether my paper gets published? They decide based on, am I doing work that's about important questions and with rigorous methods? That's what we should be evaluating on. It isn't about the results, so it should not bias what ends up being reported in the results. It should only reveal what you did and what you planned. So this, we introduced this with a special issue of the journal Social Psychology in 2014, published 13 registered reports just to demonstrate that this was possible. Now there are more than 300 journals that are offering registered reports as an option. And is the public the next one? Not yet. Okay, there might be another one coming soon in our field. I don't know, but maybe. So there are many journals. Even now, the prestige journals like Nature offers registered reports as a publishing option. So we have some accumulated experience with this model, and there's meta research now being done to see, does it actually follow through? Does it help with the things that we hoped it would? So I'll give a couple of examples of evidence about this. One is from Anne Scheel and her colleagues, where they took a sample of registered reports and then sampled from the same portion of the literature standard regular reports, where it was reviewed the usual way. What you see on the left is the proportion in dark blue of the studies in the standard reports where the hypothesis was supported, the first hypothesis. So 95% of the time, in the standard articles, the hypothesis was reported. 95% of the time, like, why bother doing the research if we're always right? Like, we just have to hypothesize it. We know we're going to be right. We're right 95% of the time. You know the problem, which is not everything is getting reported. With registered reports, you see that the support for the hypothesis was about 45% of the time. So when you don't know the results and you commit to publishing, turns out we find out that we're wrong a lot more than we thought that we were. And that's a good thing. That's eliminating that publication bias, that selective reporting, and we're getting better evidence. Now you might think, oh, so then we're putting in journals things that aren't interesting, like people, like they were wrong. But that's science. Exactly, that's science. And so we've done a couple of different things. So one is we looked at citation rates of registered reports and standard articles published in the same journal at the same time. It turns out, if anything, registered reports are cited a bit more than standard reports, even though many more of them are reporting negative outcomes. Why is that? We don't know. But one plausible hypothesis to me is that if you have to decide, we need to know the answer to this question before you know the results, then any outcome is meaningful. And so it's an informative study, whether it's a positive result or a negative result, because people said, oh, we need to know this, and this is a really good method to test it. And so readers will say, huh, that's really interesting. I'm glad I now know that, and then use the data accordingly. We did a follow-up study to this one where we took registered reports and comparison articles, either published by the same authors or published in the same journal around the same time on the similar topic. And we put them through a structured peer review process again to compare the registered report with standard articles. And what we did was we had them very structured, so we had them rate the article as they were reviewing it on a variety of different criteria. And what I'm showing you here with the dotted vertical line is the registered report and the comparison articles, the standard articles, were evaluated the same on each of the criteria. If it goes to the right of the dotted line, that means the registered report outperformed the standard articles published by either the same authors or in the same journal about the same topic. And to the left is the standard articles outperformed the registered report on that criterion. The black dot is the estimate, and the distribution is the Bayesian credible interval. And so what you can see is that in the first phase, where they read all of the initial stuff, the intro, the initial exploratory experiments, and then the methods, and then provided a review, reviewers evaluated the register reports as more rigorous methodologically, higher quality methods, said that we're going to learn more, said the quality of the question was better, said the question and the methods were better aligned than standard reports. And you can see that on every one of those criteria on the top part, register reports outperformed from weakly to strongly. Then we had them read the actual results and discussion from those registered reports and standard articles and rate them on a next set of criteria. And again, registered reports were rated as the analysis being more rigorous, the conclusions better justified, the quality of the results higher, quality of discussion higher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Amount we learned even higher, despite the fact that many of those were negative results. And then finally, they evaluated the paper holistically, and you can see on the very bottom in green, the overall ratings were also better for registered reports. Now, this itself is a single study. It's an observational study. We didn't randomly assign to registered reports versus not. We just compared with other work that those authors had done. But what it indicates is that, at least in this initial study, is the opportunity to have the way that we're evaluated for our reward can change the rigor of the work that we do. That by giving people rewards based on doing rigorous research and reporting it the best they can, we might actually wind up with more rigorous research. One of the benefits that I had not anticipated with registered reports that we see anecdotally in practice is that, one, reviewers enjoy it much more because it's just very interesting to evaluate before you know the results, make a commitment, and then when you get it back afterwards to see if they followed through, what did they find? I'm curious too. But the other thing that reviewers, they're invested, exactly. And then the other thing that the benefit for reviewers is that in the standard model, reviewers say, well, what I do in reviewing is just point out everything that they did wrong that they can't really do anything about now because the research is done. Whereas when I provide review and registered reports, I can say, I see these weaknesses and here are ways you can improve it. And so the reviewers become allies, collaborators, supporters of the work, helping make it better because their review is happening just in time rather than when it's too late. So there's lots of potential benefits of this. And I don't think it's a panacea for all things, but we have a lot of promising evidence that it not only improves the research in process, that it improves the way in which we get rewarded for that research. Okay. I want to close with a couple of different just examples of how the culture is shifting and ways to get engaged in that, and then have as much open discussion as we have time for. What I've outlined are a set of problems about how the system rewards us and some potential solutions for those things. And this has been something that our field has been engaged in, and in fact, every area of science is engaged in differing degrees. To try to, for the last more than a decade. And progress is being made on shifting behaviors toward these more open practices. So just to illustrate, I forgot to get the updated slides, so this only shows through 2022, but this is the growth of papers that mention generalist repositories, places where you share data or materials or code, in papers from 2009 through most of 2022. You can see that that is nonlinear growth. Likewise, if you say, does the paper mention pre-registration and a repository that might have that pre-registration, you can see similar nonlinear growth in adoption of that behavior. We have graphs like this for virtually every open science behavior that you can think of. The rate of change has been dramatic, and psychology as a discipline has been at the front of most of that change. Not every part of change. There are other fields that are doing better in some domains, but psychology really has been applying its own insight about human behavior to thinking about how is it that we want our human behavior in our field to be, and how might we restructure our social system to make it so that we can behave aligned with the ways that we idealize. So there are a number of different things that, if you're engaged in those ideals, that you can do yourself and with your part of the research community to help improve our research practices and inspire others to get involved in being more open and rigorous with their research. So you learned already before lunch about the OSF. It is free. It is open for everyone. It is a service that is constantly improving. We have a staff of 20 people, products, engineers, QA testers, and otherwise that are constantly working on making this more effective for supporting different types of research. So please make as much use of it as you can. There are also a variety of different groups that offer ways to get training, education, materials, insights about how to do better research. There are many. One to highlight is FORT, the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. They have lots of resources on their site for self-guided work, for materials that can be applied in the classroom, in one's own lab, in one's own work. And it is just a great community-based resource. And another way to get involved is to get involved as an activist in some way, as a reformer, as someone who says, I care about these things enough to not just do it in my own work, but I want to help my communities embrace it more. And the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science is dedicated to that for our field and is very much a grassroots organization that is looking at how do we improve training, how do we improve our own practice, how do we innovate on methods, how do we evaluate whether these things are actually working? Like, yeah, open data sounds great, but there are some risks of open data. Are we not paying attention to those risks? Are we not accounting for those risks? Are we not solving for those risks, etc.? So SIPS as a community is a great one to get involved with. And their conference that will be in Budapest this year or next year, 2025, late June. So please consider attending that if you're interested. And then a last one to mention is that there is a very broad interdisciplinary meta-science movement that has been developing. And the meta-science community is really about evaluating, generating innovations in how research gets done, and evaluating the effectiveness of those and trying to scale them. So this is a community that involves funders, policymakers, researchers from every discipline you can think of. We have hosted 3 meetings every other year since 2019. The 4th meeting will be in London in 2025, and you can look at the past program, and all the videos from the past meetings are online to see if this would be a fit to your interests. But it is a real burgeoning movement of people who are really wanting to study the social system of science and how to do it better. Let me end with noting the challenge of that social system is not just let's have the idea of how we might do things better and then start doing it. It is appreciating that that researcher is embedded with a lot of different levers that drive and constrain their behavior. So that researcher is in an institution. That university's hiring process, promotion process, training processes will shape what they can do and how they can succeed. They publish in certain journals. The policies and practices of those journals will shape how it is they do their work. They are funded by specific agencies. The expectations that those funders have will be an important influence. And the norms in our work are shaped by our societies. Most of how we decide what is good research is what our peers are doing, what we see others doing in our field as defining what good research is. So those are a lot of different agents that are totally decentralized. And if we don't have all of them shifting towards rewarding open scholarship, then it will not be sustainable. And so really the core of what our organization, the Center for Open Science, does is try to solve the coordination problem among these various agents of change and see if we can get them aligned to promoting open research practices. One example of a success there is that the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House 2 years ago issued what is known as the Nelson Memo. Alondra Nelson was the director at the time. And the Nelson Memo directed all federal agencies that fund research to come up with open science policies for sharing of data and the papers upon the end of the grants. So every agency has been working on changing their policies toward promoting more open research. So that itself is great because so much of the research that gets done in the US is driven by those federal agencies. But if they change, that's one thing. But if the universities don't catch up in how it is they decide who to hire and how to promote, then it will stifle that type of innovation. So that needs still a lot of work. But at the center is us. And we are the ones that are agents of change for ourselves and for each other in our local communities. So the more that we are providing that bottom-up groundswell, the easier it is for those that have positions of power and leverage to say, it's not just me imposing this. My community is demanding this, that I change how it is our institution works, how it is our journal works. And so the groundswell part of this is the critical element for making this type of social change happen. So there are a bunch of links here if you want more information for any of the stuff that I talked about, the slides as well. If you have a picture of it, the link at the bottom is the slides, and there's references and additional slides in the back. And I will be delighted to answer any questions that we have time to answer. So thanks very much for your time and attention. Oh yeah, so it's people online too. So come on over to the mic. You start there. Come on over. Thank you. It's not on yet. It sounds. Yep, there it goes.
Okay, thank you very much. This was very informative. You probably mentioned it already. I just wanted to know with the registered reports, when it's reviewed beforehand, it's still considered, it still has that label of peer review, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. So it goes, and I didn't get into the details, but it does go through peer review twice. So the first time it goes through review on question and methodology. The second time, the reviewers get it back, but they don't say, were they right? And so I can reject it or not. The results are the results. What they have to review there is, did they do what they said they were going to do? And are they interpreting the results responsibly? And as long as they do that, the paper gets published. But it goes through full peer review. It's a standard paper like any other paper, except better. Thanks.
I just really had a question about the second portion. What was that acronym for? And that was for what exactly?
So SIPS is the Society for Improvement of Psychological Science. And it's a grassroots organization that people who are just like, I want to do better myself, and I want to help others around me do better. So how do we get together and do things? The conference is very different than your standard conference where you have lots of talks and you just sit and listen. It's a very action-oriented type of meeting. So they'll have hackathons where someone will come in and say, I have this project idea. Let's work on trying to see if we can make it work really well and spend a few hours on it. It has just unconference events where people say, I have a problem. And I want to talk to other people who see that that's a problem too and get some perspective on it. So it's very social and active. And even for introverts, it's super exciting because you don't even have to say anything, but you're like, oh, we're doing stuff. This is cool. So it's great. So,
and are all of these things that you mentioned, are they beneficial for someone like myself? I'm still an undergrad. So where would I start in like getting more involved?
Great question. So I would start with an OSF account if you didn't get one in the last 2 hours, so that you have at least one resource where you can start to do this work for yourself. How is it that I could be more open in my work? How could I catalog my data so that if I want to share it eventually, it'll be easy to do so? Because a lot of the fundamentals of open scholarship are skills in the same way that learning statistics is a skill. And so that takes some time. And so using the occasions that you have to start to develop those skills is a great first step. If you're super excited about it, SIPS is a great meeting and it's online community. So you can start to get plugged in to how it is that people that are sort of passionate about this as a movement itself, rather than just a tool for doing my research better. That's a good one to check out. It's common for SIPs and other sort of reform-oriented things to happen at regular meetings. So if you're sticking around for psychonomics, I haven't checked, but there's likely to be some kinds of sessions that are about these issues. That's a common thing at conferences these days. And then if you get to the point where you're preparing some research, you might consider submitting a registered report to one of the journals. If you go to cos.io/RR, it'll show you most of at least the ones we're aware of, the journals that offer it as an option. You could try submitting one. What the heck? See where it goes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I was just curious, do you expect any pushback from private companies that are trying to use their research to sell their products?
We don't get any pushback about anything. That's not true. That is a total lie. Yes, so there are lots of things that are barriers to adopting openness. So private companies may feel that they have, and individual researchers too, may feel that they have competitive advantage for keeping as much secret as possible. So I don't want to show you anything because this is how I'm going to make it rich or advance my career. So there is barriers to that type of change, and some of that is not solvable or even shouldn't be solved. So for organizationally, we are not anti-patent, for example, where there is protections of evidence in order to start a commercial activity of some kind. That's fine. What we're hoping for is that when research is done for the public good, it's open. And so most of the research that happens in academic environments is intended for the public good. It's funded by taxpayer money. It's for the taxpayers to gain insights about how the research world works or how that particular phenomenon works. So that's where we would like to promote as much openness as possible. Now, it's interesting to note that some industries and corporations are seeing benefits of openness themselves. So one example is social media companies have been criticized heavily for the potential of causing harm among teams or others based on their products. And they'll say, well, no, we have internal evidence that that's not the case. And the research community says, yeah, well, whatever, show us. And that's not sufficient. So Meta has partnered with us to do a pilot on making data from Instagram available for academic researchers to study the effects of social media use on teens' well-being. It's just a pilot. It's a first step, but just them starting to crack the door a little bit on making their data more available to the academic research community is a start to say there are some things that might even be in their mission interest, their mission to make money interest, to be more open with their research. So there are opportunities to sort of push the boundaries on openness in many directions, even ones where you might anticipate, oh, they will be resistant to this for other reasons. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Throughout the presentation, what I really got from what you were speaking of within the culture or social is more of intrinsic motivational learning, more positive psychology. I just want to make sure that I was hearing it in an appropriate way in which it's fostering you take what you're not hiding your mistakes. You're actually using them to benefit and push things forward. I just want to see if I was listening correctly and getting what you're cultivating.
Yeah, I loved how you framed it there, is that we come to research for intrinsic reasons, right? We're not here because we said, oh, you can get a big paycheck doing psychology research, because you can't. Sorry. The research itself is interesting, engaging, motivated to it because of my own interests. How do we make sure that the culture itself fosters those intrinsic interests, right? We study this in education all the time, right? How do we capitalize on the intrinsic interest that kids have to learn things? And sometimes schools do a bad job of it for whatever reasons. how do we change the system of science so that our excitement of being here is actually rewarded in the system rather than stifled
Yeah.
or opposed? So you're right on target.
Okay, perfect. And then also, in addition to that, it's more so we don't like to show our flaws. And
Yeah.
with research, you have to show it but we tend to, as a behavior, kind of shun it and just changing that behavior process. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to show
Exactly.
the empathy so that we can move forward.
It is very much okay. Science is hard. We're going to make mistakes all the time. And so the point of transparency is not to prove how right we are. It's to get the community to help us identify our mistakes and do better. So you're exactly right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Howdy. So, given that psychology is in this unique position of being an empirical science that is still impacted by the social perception of its existence,
Yeah.
how do you feel a shift towards an open framework of science might have some pitfalls or ill effects in the future, given our unique positioning?
Yeah, great question. So the advantage of openness is all the things we've been talking about, but we have to wrestle with the possibilities of, wait a second, maybe there's other things that could interfere with progress by being totally open, right? So for example, controversial areas of research where there are communities, points of view, ideologies, where being more open actually puts people at risk is a real challenge, right? You can't just say, oh, it'll be fine. Research on abortion, the more open it is, the more that people oppose or support abortion might get involved that aren't involved in research at all in any way. And so how do you manage the social risks of that? And there's so many topics that one could identify in our fields where there are people that have passionate beliefs and that intersects with how they would engage with the work and with the people doing the work. Likewise, with the actual materials. So if you work with indigenous populations, open data may not be an option so easily based on whatever risks there are for that data being made available. So how do we look for ways to try to aspire to the ideals of science, but not sacrifice privacy, protection, indigenous rights, all of the other dimensions on which we recognize are also values, but sometimes are competing values. So one of the areas of innovation that we've been trying to work on and many others are thinking about are things like, how do you anonymize data effectively so that it can still meet the goals of being able to reproduce a finding, but not put at risk data that can't be made fully open? And are there unique technological solutions that allow for those to occur? So those are just a couple examples, but please.
Furthermore, I'm also thinking of, because of that more initial peer review process, what we have right now, as your graphs had shown, is somewhat of a low trust environment between professionals. There might be some pushback just from people who are worried about being negatively judged by people who are currently not following the ideals,
Yes.
at least in their own perceptions.
Right. Yes. So to the extent that you feel like your own community doesn't support being open, you may feel some risk of doing some of those practices. And that's a very common feeling that people have is, I don't know if I'd be supported or at risk for doing these behaviors. By and large, the behaviors are ones that most people, very few, we saw 90% of people recognize as things that they value. What comes up as areas of resistance are practical. So if I am open with my data, very few people say, oh, I judge you negatively because you were open with your data. They say, oh, that's cool. I'm not going to do it, but it's cool that you did. And I see that actually makes it so I can check your work. Oh, so you're exposing yourself to the possibility of error. Oh, yeah, I guess that does make you a good researcher. I value that. So I think there is a lot of opportunity when these things are already identified as good practices to be instruments of change in areas where there's some resistance. Because a lot of times what the resistance is based on is no one else is doing it. It's too hard to do it. There aren't ways to do it. I don't know how to do it. It seems like a lot of work. But if you did it, then I have to say to myself, oh, wait, okay, so she did it. So there must be a place to do it. Must be a way to do it. She seemed to do it pretty well. Oh, maybe I should look into doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much.
So aside from just working on making data more open, um, something that came to mind when you're giving this presentation that I was wondering is, how are you guys also working to improve research methods themselves? Because, for example, I was talking with someone at the last break, and we were just saying how a lot of in my research and a lot of people's research, we're using survey measures, but they're not very great. And a lot of us don't really agree with the measures we're using, but it's kind of what's out there and it's easy.
Yeah.
So are you guys also working to improve the measures we're using and the methods?
Great question. And the best place to find others that are worried about the same thing is the SIPS meeting. There's a number of sessions every year for those of people that said, I can't stand this measure. Let's work on, developing a new one. Or let's test this. It hasn't been validated across the samples and communities that I'm interested in, but I don't have access to that. So let's do a collaborative project. And, maybe if we can run the same measures at 50 universities, we can get a lot more evidence of which of these items work well, hang together the right way, show the external validity we need, et cetera. So there's a lot of that as a community activity, with the recognition that most of what we need in improving our measures and methods is more evidence that's not possible for a single group or lab to obtain. And so a lot of it requires collective action. It's like, let's share the load on actually validating these measures so that we can use them, improve them with confidence. And I think that's been a big barrier to our method development in general. It's just, it's a lot of work, and it's too much work for any individual to take on. So thanks for
I was
that.
going to say, this is really, I guess, empowering, because I'm interested in kind of moving from that self-report measure to really working more in depth with people, because as we talked before, people can be confused about what these questions are. So actually working with people in person.
Yeah,
So this is empowering to see
Right.
that people are wanting to make that kind of change.
absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. That concludes that particular session. I know online we're going to open another session. The discussion of improving psychological science is not done, however. We're going to have more of a roundtable style discussion talking about ways we are not hiding our mistakes. The question that was asked a little bit ago, I think, is a beautiful segue to our next session. So I'll let them turn the sessions over and we'll get started in a moment.